I love you, Heartworm.
And they don't always have the space or place to do it, but they do need to talk about it, right?
First of all, I feel like, I appreciate you giving me the keys to facilitate, because I know you was supposed to facilitate it starting off, and you had things going on in your life, and I just appreciate you trusting me to keep it going. And I mean, Camille corrected me the other day. I thought we was only 2 years in. She said we 3 years strong. So I mean, that's, yeah, 3 years. 3 years strong, and it has grown. It has
Wow. Has it
grown, and
been
it's grown
3
slowly. I think
years?
if everybody showed up, we'd probably have between maybe 20 to 25 people if everybody showed up. Um, but
Wow.
it was
Oh
like two
my
or three of us
God.
showing up. No,
I
for
remember the
sure.
early
So,
days, like two, three
no,
folks.
it's that we definitely want you to come back, man, because we have new fathers in there all the time, and we are experts in what we know, but I know Lonnie's doing his thing in the whole research thing, but I am not a researcher. I'm a researcher, I guess, through Google, Dr. Google, but I'm not a bona fide researcher. So yeah, we definitely need you to come back and just drop the wisdom and the knowledge that you've done and you continue to do, because it's important. But what you said about Black fathers, or just men of color in general, creating a safe space and trying to replicate that space to the masses. What I've been discovering is that, and because I work in higher ed, I know Nick used to work in higher ed. Um, when it comes to families, especially because I work, I'm the director for Trio, and we deal with students that have documented disabilities, and I work very closely with our resource center. What I'm finding is that when it comes to family of color, and we talked about this earlier, you alluded to it, is that a lot of the families, they bring their kid to college, and there are very rare transitional programs for them. And so I don't, do you find that more colleges or academia in general are catering to students with disabilities or special needs, where they're having more transitional programs? Because I had a list of colleges that have those programs, but it's not a lot. I think it's maybe 10 on the list. So like, are you seeing that more, where colleges are trying to cater to that?
I'm definitely hearing more conversations about universities wanting to do better in that space. There are some who are further along and doing better than others. And there's some programs at UNC, related to, sort of kids who are neurodivergent. I think part of it, though, too, is one of the things that happened as part of COVID. More students are showing up in general with mental health issues. And so universities are trying to figure out how to respond and put the right supports in place. But hopefully that also benefits the students who actually have, identified and documented disabilities, as we think about how to put supports into place for people who may need it. So we definitely need those programs, and there's some community colleges and four-year public universities who are doing better than others. I think with all of this, some of this lies in some professors are better than others about accommodating students with disabilities and including them, just like some teachers are better than others in their classrooms. And so you still have to help people overcome their biases about having a student with a disability in their classroom, right? I mean, the student is at a university, right? How you should figure out and support them, how to support them and accommodate them. But I do think, Tyrone, in general, to answer your question, I do think more universities are thinking about programs for students with disabilities, in part because we're just seeing more students with disabilities show up to universities, sort of more autistic students, which makes sense given the increasing prevalence numbers all the time, that they're now aging into college, and so people are trying to make space for them. So
I do have another question. Shifting the conversation just a little bit outside of the higher education realm and getting back into that K through 12 situation or younger kids. And the guys know that this is one of my, telltale, from the heart type of questions. From your experience though, Doc, and I'm talking special education, work with children and ASD, now working in the intersectionality of ASD and African American children.
Yeah.
How are parents supposed to separate a diagnosis episode from a disciplining event when taking into account the stigma of being African American in this society? So I know we had touched on it a little bit, but I think we all kind of want to make sure that as parents that we're looking at whatever the situation is appropriately and trying to find that difference between discipline and diagnosis has always been, I know, a key for me, and I know some of the other guys on the podcast have thought about it in different ways as well. So from your experience, how do we measure that or deal with that or separate that so that we're looking at it appropriately?
Yeah, that's a good question, man. I think it's an ongoing challenge, right, to figure out, is something happening because it's autism or not? But I think the reality is you really can't separate it. The kid has autism. That is part of their identity. That is part of who they are. So to some degree, are all behaviors related to autism because it's part of who that child is. I think part of this, though, is how we think about maybe discipline in the Black community, and discipline is something very personal. It's how we were raised within our family, how they saw fit to discipline us. And my advice has always been just to help families think about autism and whether their child understand the consequences they're trying to provide as a parent. Because not all kids with autism have the ability to connect the behavior they were engaged in that may have been considered inappropriate by the parent to the consequence that was provided, whether it be a yell, a spank, or whatever it is. And if the child isn't connecting behavior to consequence, then what you're doing isn't going to be effective, right? So how do we discipline or correct the child or help the child do something more appropriate in a way that's understandable to them? And that's different for every kid. Can autistic kids engage in manipulative behavior or do inappropriate things? Absolutely, they're kids. Kids do things. Kids test boundaries. All kids do that. And, it's our job as adults to help guide them and teach them the appropriate boundaries. But the other thing I'll say, though, and I think this is, again, I try to be respectful because I'm not a parent, but I think this applies in particular to Black parents. We are so get caught up in our own stigma and trauma that we are so used to being judged in general by society that we can't pass that stigma onto our kids, right? Your kid has autism. So if they're tantruming in the store, saying to someone, you know what? They have autism. That's why they're doing it. And I'm trying to help them through that. If you have a suggestion around how you can help them through that, tell me right now, right? But don't get caught up in that sort of societal pressure that we feel as Black people because we're constantly being judged. Don't pass that or push that on to your kid, right? Because they're always going to have autism. It's just going to be part of who they are. So we have to cope with and accept that sometimes they're going to do something in public that's going to be embarrassing maybe, or that's going to be interpreted in a different way by the folks who are looking and judging, and we have to accept some of that. But I think some of it comes from our experience of always feeling like somebody's watching us, somebody's judging us, somebody's just waiting to say, oh, you doing that because you Black, and that's how Black people act, and all the shit that comes along with being Black sometimes, that we can't, we just can't pass that stuff to our kids, right? And so we have to sit with that stigma sometimes and realize when we're passing that on to our kids that sometimes it's about us. It's not about the kid.
Yeah,
Appreciate that, Doc.
I had a question for you. I know you mentioned a little bit earlier, switching gears, about prevalence rates of diagnosis with certain minority groups are sort of equivalent or eclipsing rates with white kids, but we're still seeing a significant number of more boys being diagnosed and not girls. And so there's some emerging research on camouflaging and some of the reasons for that. And so I've been really surprised at the fact that there's like very little, if any, research on African American girls and women. So what are some of your thoughts on that? Why we aren't seeing more diagnosis in women and girls of color?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lonnie. I mean, probably some of it is societal and how we socialize boys versus girls. And, most of our diagnostic tools are really based on diagnosing boys with autism. So, some of the symptoms may be more subtle sometimes in girls. And so I think we have to reframe or retrain ourselves, or those who engage in diagnosis, and how autism may look in girls. But, I think the other part of that, though, is in so many ways in society, Black women get overlooked. And I think in autism, it's another way. And so little we know about Black autistic girls, it's just another way Black women get overlooked in society. A mom reached out to me, a Black mom, because she had an autistic girl. And she was like, send me anything about Black autistic girls. I was like, I can send you like a couple qualitative studies that involve like 4 or 5 girls. But that's it. In terms of large scale research, what do we know about Black autistic girls? Not a lot. And so, that's why we need people pushing for that work, advocating for understanding their unique perspectives, right? And not continuing to overlook that they're probably experiencing something different, because we're probably missing out on diagnosing Black autistic girls because we know so little about them and what autism looks like with girls, with Black girls with autism. So, I think it's just another way that we need to sort of be pushing back on the narrative of who has autism, what autism looks like, and sort of advance some of the work in this space so that we aren't missing out on groups of folks.
I did have one other question, switching gears again.
Yeah.
I think in the beginning you mentioned talked about funding. My understanding is a lot of the funding for autism work is going towards genetic, going towards some of those things. And we know, I've been surprised at how few minorities or Black folks are in those genetic databases. It's almost unbelievable how low the numbers are. But I just started reading some literature, and here's one of my sort of, I guess, things that make me cringe. I'm thinking about. I guess the goal is to be able to develop some tools or mechanisms to say, here's a blood test, et cetera, to say this child is at risk of autism, right? But I don't know how many good outcomes can come from that when I think about the potential negative outcomes. Mm-hmm. And just in terms of a personal story, my wife was pregnant and my son had 2 markers for Down syndrome. And they wanted to do amniocentesis, an additional test that comes with a lot of risk. And I was like, nope. I asked the doctor, I said, what's the percentage of folks who don't carry on pregnancies when they have Downs? He said 100%.
It's really
and hard. So there's some emerging research that talks about the potential risk being the same thing with autism. We're going to see a major function in that particular genetic, whatever results might be.
And the percentage of parents who decide not to then have a child with Down syndrome is quite high. It's the number of parents who decide to have an abortion. And the question is, if we ever have a genetic test for autism and parents are told, when they're pregnant, there's your chances your kid's going to go and develop autism where they start making those same kinds of decisions. I'm not a geneticist, but I don't think we're anywhere close to having autism is so complicated. We know very little about the genetics of autism, even with all the autistic people running around and the genetics we have. So I don't know. I don't think we're anywhere close to that, but I know a lot of autistic people are having this conversation and wondering if genetics in general, doing genetics research in autism, if will lead to having blood tests and those kinds of things for autism, where parents will have to think about and make those kinds of decisions. I think that I don't know the best way to counter it, Lonnie. I mean, first, I don't know if we'll ever get there, because autism is way more complicated than Down syndrome in terms of a genetic basis. We know the genetic markers or chromosomes involved in Down syndrome. We don't have that kind of knowledge, and autism is way more complex. But I think that part of that is just developing a counter narrative that autism is not a death sentence. There are a lot of people who live wonderful, productive, fulfilling lives as autistic people, right? And just allowing parents to see that this is not, your child can have a great, great life, right, as an autistic person. But then also, how do we as a society, like our acceptance of people with disabilities, our willingness to put in supports for people with disabilities? Some of this is about societal attitude about disability too, right? That takes a culture shift and sort of how we think about it. I would tell you, I just got back with Camille, actually, from Color of Autism. I just got back from Lagos in Nigeria, and we were at an autism conference. And part of the conference was to have us providers talk to families and kids. There are probably about 20, 30 providers, speech paths, OTs, BCBAs, special educators, psychologists, psychiatrists. I probably saw about 20, 30 families of kids with autism, a variety of places in their acceptance and understanding of autism. But it just reminds me that this is worldwide. This is everywhere. Parents everywhere are dealing with the same issues, but parents everywhere are trying to do the best they can. This was the clinic went for 3 days. We opened from like 10 to 5, and parents were there, had come from miles away, lining up at like 6, 7 in the morning just to get advice about their kids. And that speaks to, parents wanting to do the right thing. And I think that's what we have to remember. Parents want to do the right thing by their kids. Once they have them, once they're here, the majority of parents, once they're here on this earth, right, around the world. So my first time in the motherland, I'm telling you, man, it was weird. I had never been on an African continent, and I was like, I don't know. I felt like this connection. And then we heard Afrobeats in Nigeria. Oh my God. I was like, ay. And I was feeling some kind of way. Like, everybody's black. I was like, man, everybody's black.
I wanted to ask you, for individuals that are older, so like myself, like I'm going on 40. Probably shouldn't have said that on this podcast, but I don't care. I'm going on 40. And I am taking a series of tests to see if I am on the spectrum. I'm actually taking it this month. It's going to be in the next couple of weeks. And so I'm not going to lie. I'm nervous. I'm scared. And I do think that if it does turn out that I am on the spectrum, or, I have ADHD or something along the lines of that, it will answer a lot of questions throughout my life, questions I didn't have the answer to, questions I have now as an adult of why I do have certain quirks and things that, personality quirks and things like that. So what advice do you have for individuals that are older, that are thinking about getting tested? And do you think, because I don't think it's never too late to get tested, but what advice do you have for individuals that may know that they have something going on, but they're scared to get tested because they're afraid of what they might discover? What advice do you have for those individuals?
Man, I would say if that knowledge is going to be helpful for you, pursue it, right? If it's going to help answer some questions for you and help you understand yourself better, pursue it. I'm not sharing anything that's private because this was at the conference in Lagos that I was at. But I met this brother. He's on the spectrum. He has 3 kids on the spectrum. He was sharing his story. I think he was at the conference last year too. But he was actually a rapper and a producer. He lives in London now. I should actually try to get him to come to you guys' group. This is the coolest dude. But he got diagnosed as an adult as a result of 3 of his kids having autism. But you wouldn't know he was on the spectrum. He blessed us with freestyle. He was one of the guys I was out with listening to the Afrobeats. He was the coolest dude ever. But he was saying like how like going through that experience was helpful for him and helped him understand some things about his own childhood, but also I think helped him understand his own kids a little bit better and sort of empathize and understand them in a different way than not having that knowledge. So I think it's good to know all kinds of things about yourself. I mean, I hate going to the doctor because I don't know what they're going to say, but I got high blood pressure. I need to know now I'm on some medication, So, knowing things about yourself, it's.
I do have a quick question. I mean, based on of your research, I know Tyrone was talking about research in adults with ASD. Where do you see the next research shift moving? I know that we're, just starting to talk maybe over the last 2 or 3 years about African Americans and intersectionality around ASD. I know that people are looking at aging individuals with ASD. Where do you think the research for autism and the impacts on society, where do you think the next big leap or the next big group will come?
Yeah. Oh, gosh, you guys are good. I definitely think aging and autism is one. That's a big one because we don't know a lot about what it's like to age with autism. Are people more at risk for mental health conditions, physical health conditions, or earlier mortality? I mean, there are all kinds of questions that are out there that we need to answer as we have an aging population. I think there's going to be continued interest or more interest on sort of some of the what we call co-occurring conditions in autism. So like a lot of autistic kids seem to have GI issues, so gastrointestinal issues for some reason, co-occurring issues like mental health, like depression and anxiety. And so starting to study some of those co-occurring issues, because actually, what we're beginning to find is some of the symptoms of autism are really impacted by some of those co-occurring issues. I mean, imagine you having stomach issues, then yeah, you're probably more likely to tantrum and act out, and if you're not feeling well. And we're even seeing things like self-injurious behavior being related to issues of anxiety and depression in kids with autism. So, it's just their way of expressing some of those things that they're feeling internally to some degree. So to some degree, those co-occurring conditions are treatable. We know how to treat GI issues. We have some strategies for dealing with anxiety and depression, and they may sort of lessen some of the symptoms of autism. And then I think the other piece of it, Nick, a little bit is just certainly under researched groups. So, kids of color, kids who are nonverbal and don't speak, kids with what we're calling profound autism who have very severe intellectual disabilities are less likely to live independently as they get older. So some of those under-researched groups are sort of resurging a little bit so we can have more research on them.
A lot of, there's always good days and bad days, right? When it comes to being a Black father or a father of color in general, and you're raising a child on the spectrum, what advice do you have for fathers who know that there's something going on with their child, but not necessarily understanding that there's something deeper going. Because I've dealt with a lot of fathers or men in general who have kids where, and we talk about this in the group. We have a friend in the group named Dre who talks about when you have a kid on the spectrum, you almost kind of have like autism goggles on because you can see people in the world and, making it's an assumption, but it's like, hey, that person might be on the spectrum. And I deal with fathers in education, in higher education, outside higher education, where I see their child and I'm like, I think that kid might be on the spectrum. Again, just an assumption, don't really know. But the father's like, nah, he'll grow out of it, or, in denial, whatever the case may be. It's like, oh, it'll just being a kid. What advice do you have for fathers or families in general that are struggling with a child that may have ASD or anything like that's kind of afraid to step into that realm of getting that diagnosis?
Yeah, man, that's a deep one. I think one of the things I recognized, every family unique is in their journey towards acceptance. They all on a different journey, and some families get there faster than others. But I think one of the things we're beginning to learn, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is that when kids accept themselves, autistic kids accept themselves, they see it as part of their identity. They seem to be doing better and have positive outcomes in a number of ways. And I think it just intuitively, it makes sense. If we are comfortable in our own skin with who we are, it makes us better able to navigate this world. And so when parents come on board and say, you know what, that's my kid. My kid has autism. That's part of their story. That's part of their identity. That's just part of who they are. And if we can build that acceptance and understanding into the kids themselves, right, where they understand that's just part of who I am. It's not all of who I am, but it's part of who I am. That it helps support them in their lives, right? And I think we all want to understand where we come from, who we are, what makes us us. Whatever that is, like that, just that acceptance of ourselves and understanding ourselves is really something deep and personal. And so I think it's understanding that it really benefits your child for parents to accept them and for parents to help them accept themselves. It doesn't mean you can't do things to improve your children's outcomes, to work on their language, all parents are going to parent and help their children, but helping them understand who they are and accept who they are is a big part of it too.
And my son's favorite superhero is Miles Morales. And he can identify with Miles Morales because Miles Morales is half black and half Latino, and my son is half black and half Latino. And so we use his ASD and say, hey, this is your superpower. Your brain works differently than a neurotypical person, than I guess that quote unquote average person. And so he looks at it as a positive thing. There are days where he recognized that he has challenges and struggles with some of the things that come along with ASD. But the question I have for you is, do you recommend that parents tell their kids that they have ASD? Because I know it's different for everyone. And so we decided to tell him because he was starting to ask questions about things that he was doing, some of his personality quirks and things that he had challenges with. He would, look at his siblings and say, hey, why don't my siblings, have this trait and things like that? And so what, in your opinion, do you think it's a positive thing for parents to let their kids know at an early age that they have ASD, or do you think it just depends on the person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know sort of the ideal time to have that conversation. That's probably very personal to the family and the child. And obviously the conversation is going to look different for some kids who don't have the cognitive ability to really understand what that means. And maybe for that family, it's more about the parents themselves accepting that their kid has autism. But there are definitely going to be kids who understand what that means. But what I've found, and this is anecdotal, this is not based on data I've collected or anything, is that the kid sometimes, like you were talking about your own journey, Tyrone, the kid, sometimes it really helps the kid understand themselves a lot more, like why they do the things they do. right? It's just giving them more information to help them understand themselves. And so I think if we see it, it's not about the label or the word, but really just helping kids understand who they are, and why they do some of the things they do. That you're just giving them more information and knowledge about themselves, right? I don't think you have to go into a long dialogue or diatribe about autism or research everything about autism. You're just really helping kids understand a part of who they are a little bit. And kids will want to learn more and ask more questions as they get older. But I guess I think in general, I don't think it's a harmful thing, because I don't know what's the point of hiding it, because nowadays it's likely that some other kid at school might say something to your kid. You seem autistic to me, and you want them to have a positive framing of what that means, right?
The conversation with this individual, they felt like them not knowing actually helped push them further in life, because they said to themselves, like, well, if I would have known I had ASD back then, I probably would have struggled a lot more mentally with it. And so it was just an interesting perspective. I don't want to say that they were right or wrong, but that's why I asked the question, like, do you think it's a good idea? Because I know that some individuals, like that person said, hey, I'm glad I found out later, because I was able to live, quote unquote, somewhat of a normal or different life, however you want to frame it. And then for myself and my wife and my kids, like, I'm glad he knows, because like you said, I think that, because he knows that he's different, and, his mind works differently, he can, to me, cope better with his emotions. But I think it just depends on the person, because that person said they glad they found out later in life. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely a personal journey, right? To some degree.
Yeah.
So I do have one more question, and just framing it around education and K through 12. As a previous special education, somebody worked in special education, Doc, what information would you give schools, school administrators, current special educators, and advice, information about dealing with children with ASD and the educational plans, 504 IEPs that traditionally come associated with those diagnoses? Like, what information, advice would you give school systems regarding dealing, more specifically, with African Americans with ASD in those plans?
Yeah, that's a good one, man. I mean, there are so many ways families get left out of that process, even though they're by law supposed to be included in the process. I used to give advice to families. If you can't take your kid, take a picture of your kid to those meetings to remind everybody what the meeting is about. It's not about your profession. It's not about you being the speech pathologist in the room or the special educator in the room. It's about this kid and how we personalize their intervention to best meet their needs. Right. The problem is, it's just that stuff is so caught up in bureaucracy and paperwork, and people feel like they have to get things done because by law you're supposed to do it in a certain amount of time and all that stuff. But it's really just remembering what that meeting is supposed to be about, right? And the other piece of that is how we make it strengths based, as Tyrone was talking about. What are the superpowers for that kid? Right? It's not just about all the things that they are having difficulty doing, but what are the strengths of that child, and how can we leverage that strengths to help overcome some of the challenges that they may be having. We'll spend as much time in that meeting talking about the positive things and the good things that the child is showing up and doing within the context of the classroom, right? Because you'll get to some of the challenges and things that need to be worked on over the course of the year. But I think if we could just make time and space for families and center the kid at those meetings, they'd be a lot better and more productive and more helpful for the kid but also for the adults in that room, because you'll really learn some things about that kid, right? Versus, we got an hour and then I have to be somewhere else, so I need you to sign this form so we don't have to meet again. And just the compliance, it's just really about compliance now versus really about thinking how we can individualize education for a particular child. So, and look, I know everybody's stretched thin, and there, as you guys probably know, there are all kinds of workforce shortages, in particular in schools, as like the teachers are dropping left and right, in particular in special education for a variety of reasons. But for those who are left standing, we still need to figure out a way to best meet the needs of kids, because they deserve it, right? So,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I mean, specific to Black kids, I just think just recognizing that children of color are just sometimes having a different experience in school settings. that needs to be recognized, right? That they likely have a different experience.
Your one last question I have is thinking about K through 12 and education, and I have not had that discussion with my son. We have not disclosed his diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it took me a couple years for I could, like, me being able to be on this call and say I'm a parent of autistic child is, like, honestly probably something I can, past 2 years I can do comfortably, right? But when I look at his journey educationally, long story short, I recognize that 25, 30 kids in the classroom was never going to be a good setting for him. And it was the right thing for us to move him to a smaller setting, et cetera. We finally, 3 schools later, we have him in a really good setting where they can cater his learning, and it's really assets based. So he's really starting to make significant progress in different areas. And so he's not recognizable from where he was, even 3-4 years ago. And so I've been very happy with his progress.
Yeah.
But a part of that has been my research. What I'm interested in is, just because we have the financial means to inundate him with services, to inundate him with interventions and tutors and whatnot, shouldn't be. I think we need to figure out a way to make access to interventions and supports more plentiful, more easily, assessed by other folks. That's something I think about a lot. How can we help other families earlier get these interventions? But thinking about K through 12, I've been really surprised at the what we know, just the suspensions rates for autistic kids in pre-K and kindergarten. So I'm like, I can't believe those rates. So, and then we know that Black kids are disproportionately suspended. And so, long story short, it seems that there's a lot more Black autistic kids at risk of getting suspended and expelled in pre-K and kindergarten. And so, just to tag on to what Nick said, what can we do to help teachers understand that? What can we do to help them navigate that space of understanding? In fact, what you're doing is suspending kids based on disability, and it's more complicated than what we make it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good one, Lonnie. I think part of it is helping educators recognize their own implicit biases that are at work. Because we see this play out in a number of different ways, that Black kids, even when they commit the same sort of engage in the same sort of inappropriate behavior, if you will, as a white kid, they tend to receive a harsher punishment for the same behavior. Right. And this plays itself out in a lot of different ways. And teachers tend to pay more attention to Black kids, in particular Black boys. Like, they're almost looking for them to do something, right? So they can catch them and punish them in some way. So, like, helping people understand how those implicit racial biases are playing out within the context of classrooms. Like, why are we spending time watching Black boys in that way? Why are we thinking that they're going to do something that's different? But also, how do we understand, how the classroom in many ways isn't set up for how boys engage and learn, because boys are just more active in general. We still have these old mentalities that kids are supposed to just sit all day. And then when you add disability on top of that and issues of attention span and stuff like that's just, classroom environments need to be modified to really support all learners in different learning styles to some degree. But I think part of it is just helping teachers understand the implicit biases that are at work, that are leading sort of to discrepancies in how some kids, in particular kids of color, are treated within the school. But there are all kinds of ways, as you know, Lonnie and others, there are built-in racial inequities in the system because it is a system.
All right. Well, that's well said. We don't want to keep you too much longer, Dr. Boyd. We really appreciate your time, sir. And we thank you for your knowledge and your wisdom. And I really hope that, you continue to do the great work that you're doing, because you are much needed. The saying is giving people their flowers while they're still here. So we definitely want to give you your flowers, brother. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you. I just want to say thanks for having me, guys. But I do mean this. I don't want to be like the black face of autism. My mission is to build other Black scholars in the field. I occupy a certain position and status in the field, and I have sort of the name, if you will, to be able to do that. So my career is all about how I can grow the pipeline of other Black researchers to be able to walk in this space. So it was good seeing all you guys. It was good seeing all you guys. I'm glad you're all doing well, and the group is still going strong, man. Yeah.
We still growing strong, Dr. Brian. We gonna continue to keep it going. So just want to say thank you again. And this is AutisHim, Black Fathers in Autism, and we out.
Peace.